The courtroom was charged with tension, as if the very walls might close in on the people within. Every eye was fixed on the two men at the center of the drama. Judge John Miller sat back in his chair, a smug grin spreading across his face. His sharp eyes gleamed with amusement as he studied the man standing before him, Mayor James Garrett. "Your Honor," Mayor Garrett began, his voice steady but betraying a slight edge, "I must say, this trial has taken a rather unexpected turn." Judge Miller chuckled, shaking his head. "Unexpected?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "No, Mr. Mayor, this is exactly how it was always going to end." He paused, allowing the words to settle. "You thought you could walk into my courtroom and lecture me on justice? How quaint." Turning to the gallery, he gestured dismissively. "Ladies and gentlemen, our dear mayor here thought he could challenge the law without even knowing how it works." Laughter rippled through the room. Garrett stood still, unwavering under the mocking gaze of the judge. His face remained calm, but his eyes grew harder. Judge Miller leaned forward, his smirk widening. "You should have brought a lawyer, James. Watching you fumble your way through legal arguments is embarrassing," he said, savoring the moment. But just as it seemed Garrett's humiliation was complete, something shifted in the air. The mayor exhaled deeply, his posture straightening. His face remained calm, but a quiet resolve replaced any uncertainty. With a sudden air of confidence, he took a step forward and spoke, his voice cool and clear. "I didn't bring a lawyer, John," Garrett said, his tone cutting through the mockery, "because I don't need one." A low murmur spread through the room. Judge Miller's confident smirk faltered for the first time. "What do you mean you don't need one?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You're not a lawyer." Garrett smiled, his eyes locking onto Miller's. "Because I am a lawyer." Gasps filled the room, and reporters scrambled to take notes. The tension in the courtroom thickened as every pair of eyes turned between Garrett and Miller. For the first time, Judge Miller looked unsure, his grip tightening around his gavel. "Impossible," Miller muttered, almost to himself. His usual confidence seemed to flicker. Garrett's calm smile never wavered. "You, of all people, should know, John," Garrett said quietly. "Nothing is impossible in a court of law." The judge blinked, his earlier self-assuredness crumbling. The air in the room grew heavy with anticipation. The power dynamic had shifted. But how did they get here? How had a courtroom meant to uphold justice turned into a battlefield of egos? It all began 2 months earlier, when James Garrett took office as the mayor of Springfield. Known for his dedication to fairness, Garrett had made it his mission to serve the people. If there was a problem, he solved it. If someone was struggling, he found a way to help. However, not everyone shared his vision for the town. Judge John Miller, who had presided over Springfield's court for over 20 years, was a man who ruled with an iron fist. To him, power wasn't about justice. It was about control. His courtroom had long been a place where he humiliated those who appeared before him, particularly those who dared to challenge his authority. When Garrett began pushing for court reforms, Miller saw it as a direct attack on his reign. The conflict reached a boiling point one afternoon when Garrett arranged a meeting with Judge Miller in his office. The two were supposed to discuss possible reforms to make the legal system more fair, but from the moment Garrett stepped into the room, he knew it wasn't going to be a civil conversation. Miller, leaning back in his chair with a smug smile, wasted no time. "James," he said smoothly, "I appreciate the visit, but let's not pretend you have any say over how I run my courtroom." Garrett, undeterred, took a deep breath. "The people of Springfield deserve a system that protects them, not one that intimidates them. You can't keep treating defendants like dirt." Miller chuckled dismissively. "And you can't keep pretending you're some kind of hero," he sneered. "You're a politician, not a judge. Stay in your lane." Garrett clenched his jaw, but remained calm. "I'm asking you, man to man, to reconsider the way you handle cases." Miller waved him off. "I'm telling you, it's not your concern," he said with finality. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have more important matters to attend to." Garrett left that day with one thing clear. Judge Miller wasn't going to change. If something wasn't done soon, Springfield would continue to suffer under his rule. He knew he had to do something drastic to fight back. 2 weeks later, a case landed on Garrett's desk that would change everything. It involved a local family, Anna Carter, a single mother, and her teenage son, Tyler. Tyler had been caught shoplifting food from a grocery store. It was a mistake, but instead of offering him a fair hearing, Judge Miller humiliated both Tyler and his mother in court. Garrett had been there, witnessing the cruelty firsthand. It was wrong, and it pushed him to take action. In a move no mayor had made before, Garrett filed an official complaint against Judge Miller. The news rocked Springfield. Some hailed Garrett for standing up to the judge, while others warned him that he was making a dangerous enemy. When Garrett and Miller crossed paths again, the judge's fury was apparent. "You think you can challenge me?" Miller Street Garrett met his glare, unfazed. "I know exactly what I'm doing," he said, "and I'm not afraid of you." James Garrett sat in his office late one night, the soft hum of the city in the distance. He had just returned from a long council meeting, but the weight of the day's events still hung heavily on him. The lawsuit against Judge Miller was progressing, but Garrett knew it wasn't enough. The judge had entrenched himself in the system for decades, and the battle wasn't just about one case, or even one mayor's challenge. It was about exposing a system that had been broken for far too long. He thought back to the moment he'd first met Judge Miller, years ago when Garrett was still a young attorney fresh out of law school. At the time, Garrett had admired the judge's authority and conviction, believing Miller upheld the law with fairness and integrity. But as time passed, Garrett saw another side of Miller, one that didn't just wield the law, but manipulated it for his own power. Miller had always been about control. He ran his courtroom like a dictatorship, humiliating those who came before him, often for no other reason than to remind them of his power. The people who stood trial in Miller's courtroom were not just defendants. They were subjects who needed to be put in their place. And Garrett, with his belief in justice, had never been able to reconcile that. The day he filed the complaint against Miller had been a turning point. Garrett knew it would make him enemies, but he hadn't expected the level of retaliation that followed. Miller's reach in Springfield ran deep, and once Garrett dared to question his authority, Miller used his influence to make the mayor's life difficult. It wasn't just in the courtroom anymore. In the weeks following the complaint, Garrett began noticing odd things. A few of the city's more influential residents, people he'd once considered allies, had started to distance themselves. Business owners who had always supported his initiatives now hesitated to speak out against the judge's behavior. Garrett began to realize just how far Miller's control reached. It wasn't just the courtroom. It was the entire town. Miller had made sure of it, using fear and intimidation to keep the people in line. It wasn't until the case of the Carter family that Garrett realized just how much power Miller had, and how much he was willing to use that power to break people. Tyler Carter, the young boy who had been caught shoplifting, had a rough life. His family was struggling, barely scraping by. Anna Carter, his mother, worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, and yet Tyler felt the need to steal a loaf of bread just to eat. Garrett couldn't help but feel for the family. He saw the desperation in Anna's eyes. heard the remorse in Tyler's voice as he apologized over and over again for his mistake. But in Judge Miller's courtroom, there was no understanding, no room for redemption. Instead, Tyler was mocked, his mother humiliated, as Miller turned the trial into a spectacle. It was then that Garrett realized this wasn't just about one case. This was about Miller's thirst for power and his willingness to trample on anyone who stood in his way. That day in the courtroom, Garrett had been a bystander, but he couldn't stay silent any longer. Watching the cruelty unfold in front of him, Garrett decided he couldn't let it go. Filing the complaint against Miller had been a calculated risk, but it had been the right thing to do. Garrett knew that if he didn't stand up to the judge now, the people of Springfield would continue to suffer under Miller's rule. But the lawsuit wasn't without its challenges. The power of Miller's influence over the local legal system was undeniable. The media had become divided, with some reporters taking Miller's side, questioning Garrett's motivations. The judge was a powerful figure, respected by many, and the idea that a mayor could challenge him seemed almost absurd. There were whispers that Garrett was playing politics, using the trial to further his own career, and the more Miller's supporters pushed back, the more Garrett's resolve hardened. It wasn't long before the mayor found himself facing another uphill battle. A group of citizens, fed up with Miller's abuse of power, filed their own case against him. The lawsuit was a blow to Miller's image, but Garrett knew it was only the beginning. The fight was far from over, and he would need to be strategic if he wanted to bring the judge down. One afternoon, Garrett received a phone call that would change everything. Olivia Harrison, a former court clerk under Judge Miller, had come forward with a piece of crucial evidence. She had worked for Miller for years, and she had seen firsthand the corruption that ran through the judge's decisions. Garrett knew the risks. Going up against Miller was dangerous, and anyone who opposed him was likely to become a target. But this was the break Garrett had been waiting for. Olivia's voice was shaky as she explained what she had uncovered. I have proof, James," she said, her words coming in a rush. "Miller has been taking bribes, fixing cases for wealthy defendants. I've seen the paperwork, the transactions. I couldn't keep silent anymore." Garrett felt his heart race. This was the smoking gun he had been looking for. But he also knew it came with risks. If Miller found out Olivia had come forward, she would be in danger. The judge was ruthless, and Garrett had already seen the lengths he was willing to go to maintain control. But Garrett couldn't back down now. For Olivia's sake, and for the people of Springfield, he had to see this through. Over the next few days, Garrett worked tirelessly to gather evidence, interviewing witnesses, tracking down the documents Olivia had provided. He had everything he needed to prove Miller's corruption. But the fight wasn't over. As the court date loomed closer, Garrett knew that the real battle was just beginning. Miller wouldn't go down without a fight. The day of the court hearing arrived, and the atmosphere outside the courthouse was electric. A crowd had gathered, both for and against James Garrett. The media was out in full force, cameras flashing as they waited for the arrival of the mayor. Garrett stepped out of his car, his face stoic and focused. He had spent months preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, rallying support. And now, it was time to face Judge Miller in the courtroom. As Garrett made his way through the crowd, he could feel the eyes on him, some supportive, others skeptical. The challenge he had undertaken wasn't just about winning a case. It was about exposing a system that had been rigged for years, a system built on fear, control, and the manipulation of the law for personal gain. Garrett knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was a fight he couldn't back down from. Inside the courtroom, Judge Miller sat at his bench, his usual smug expression firmly in place. He hadn't anticipated this moment. No one had. Garrett had carefully planned his strategy. He wasn't going to just defend himself. He was going to tear down the entire foundation of Miller's rule. The courtroom fell silent as Garrett took his place at the defendant's table. The judge's gavel slammed down, signaling the start of the proceedings. "I trust we're all ready to begin?" Judge Miller asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He glanced at Garrett, clearly eager to remind him who held the power here. Garrett stood, his eyes fixed on the judge. "I'm ready, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady and clear. The words that followed would send shock waves through the courtroom. "I didn't bring a lawyer, John," Garrett said, turning toward Miller, "because I am a lawyer." The room went silent. Gasps rippled through the gallery, and reporters frantically scribbled notes. Judge Miller's expression shifted for the briefest moment, from smug to uncertain, as he processed what Garrett had just said. "You're not a lawyer," Miller scoffed, trying to regain control of the room. "You're a politician. Stay in your lane." But Garrett's confidence only grew. He had prepared for this. He had known that Miller would try to belittle him, to reduce him to just another politician playing in a world he didn't belong. But Garrett was no ordinary politician. He had spent years in the courtroom before moving into public service. He knew the law as well as anyone. "Actually, John," Garrett replied, his voice calm but firm, "I passed the bar years ago. I practiced law in New York for 7 years before returning to Springfield, and I've kept my license active all these years." The realization hit like a thunderclap. For a moment, Judge Miller didn't know how to respond. He had underestimated Garrett, assuming that the mayor was just another career politician with no legal expertise. But now, Miller's confidence had cracked, and Garrett knew it. The entire room shifted. The power dynamic had been turned on its head. The judge tried to regain his composure, but his voice was no longer as sure as it had been before. "This is absurd," Miller muttered, gripping his gavel tightly. "You have no place here, Garrett. You're not a lawyer anymore. You're just a political pawn." Garrett didn't flinch. He had known Miller would try to belittle him, but he also knew that the truth had a way of cutting through the noise. He had studied Miller's every move, and he was prepared to fight back. "You don't get to decide what I am, John," Garrett said, "and you certainly don't get to decide what's fair and just in this courtroom. You've abused your power for too long, and today, that stops." The tension in the room was palpable. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Garrett had crossed a line, and he wasn't turning back. He had just set the stage for a battle that would have repercussions far beyond this courtroom. Judge Miller's face reddened with fury. He slammed his gavel down, but it was clear that the control he once had over the room was slipping. He turned to the prosecution and gestured for them to proceed, clearly eager to move the case along without further confrontation. But Garrett wasn't done yet. "This isn't just about me, John," Garrett continued, his voice steady. "This is about the people of Springfield, the families who've suffered because of your reckless, corrupt rulings. It's about the citizens who've been silenced by fear. Today, we end that. We expose the truth." The courtroom was electric now. The prosecution began presenting their case, but it was clear that the momentum had shifted. Garrett wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was dismantling Miller's reign. He presented evidence, one piece after another, exposing the judge's corruption and abuse of power. Bribery, manipulation, the deliberate destruction of lives in the name of control. Miller's expression soured as each new piece of evidence was presented. He tried to object, but it was futile. The truth was out in the open, and for the first time in his career, Judge Miller was powerless. "You can object all you want, John," Garrett said, turning to face the judge. But the facts speak for themselves. You've been abusing your position for years, and now it's time to answer for it. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. The crowd was on edge, unsure of what would happen next. But Garrett knew that he had finally taken control of the situation. He wasn't just fighting for his reputation, he was fighting for the people of Springfield. And he was willing to go to any length to make sure justice was served. As the court session ended for the day, Garrett stepped out of the courtroom, his heart racing. He knew that this was just the beginning. Judge Miller wasn't going to go down without a fight, but Garrett was ready for whatever came next. The war for justice had just begun. James Garrett sat at his desk, reviewing the case files late into the night. The courtroom battle had shifted in his favor, but he knew it was far from over. Judge John Miller was a dangerous man, and despite the progress he'd made, Garrett couldn't afford to let his guard down. The corruption that had been exposed was just the tip of the iceberg. Miller had spent years building his empire on a foundation of fear and manipulation, and it wasn't going to crumble easily. Garrett leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The evidence against Miller was overwhelming, but the fight was now about more than just the judge's criminal activities. It was about breaking the hold Miller had over the entire legal system in Springfield. The people who had once been afraid to speak out were beginning to rally behind Garrett. The town was waking up to the truth, and that made Miller desperate. But Garrett knew the real danger wasn't just Miller's influence in the courtroom. It was the power he had cultivated outside it, the connections, the allies, and the deep pockets of those who had benefited from his rulings. Garrett had seen how the town had been divided into two factions, those who feared Miller's wrath and those who saw him as untouchable. If Garrett was going to win, he needed to show the people of Springfield that the justice system was not above scrutiny, and that no one, not even a judge, was above the law. The next day, Garrett met with Olivia Harrison, the former court clerk who had come forward with key evidence. Olivia had been hesitant to speak out at first, afraid of what Miller would do to her. But after seeing the momentum Garrett had built, she was ready to help bring the judge down. "I have something else," Olivia said, as she handed Garrett a thick file of documents. "I've been going through the records again. There's more. More cases Miller fixed. More people he's protected. The paperwork is all here." Garrett's eyes widened as he flipped through the file. "This is it," he said quietly, his pulse quickening. "This is everything we need to bury him." Olivia nodded, her face serious. "I didn't want to get involved, but the way he's hurt people, I can't stand by anymore." Garrett looked at her, his gratitude mixed with concern. "You've done the right thing, but we have to be careful. Miller is dangerous. If he finds out you've been helping me, he won't hesitate to come after you." Olivia's jaw tightened. "I'm not afraid of him anymore. He's the one who should be scared." Garrett smiled, though it was tinged with bitterness. "I wish I could say I'm not afraid of him too, but we have to keep pushing. We have to make sure we've got every angle covered." Over the next few weeks, Garrett worked tirelessly with Olivia, cross-referencing the documents and digging deeper into Miller's dealings. They uncovered bribes, illegal payments, and even evidence that Miller had been actively covering up crimes for the powerful people in town. The more they uncovered, the more Garrett realized how deep the rot went. Miller wasn't just a corrupt judge. He was the linchpin in a web of deceit that extended far beyond the courtroom. Then came the day that Garrett received a call that would shake him to his core. It was late at night when his phone buzzed. The caller ID showed an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "James Garrett," a voice said on the other end, cold and clipped. "I have information for you, but you need to listen carefully." Garrett's heart began to race. "Who is this?" Someone who knows the truth about Judge Miller, the voice replied, and someone who knows what you're trying to do. But if you're going to win, you need to get this evidence out before Miller has a chance to cover his tracks. Garrett's mind raced as the voice continued. There's a warehouse on the east side of town. Go there tonight. You'll find everything you need. The call ended abruptly before Garrett could ask any more questions. The suddenness of the message left him with a knot in his stomach. He wasn't sure if this was a trap or if it was someone genuinely trying to help, but he couldn't afford to ignore it. He grabbed his jacket, his heart pounding with both excitement and fear. An hour later, Garrett stood in front of an old, dilapidated warehouse on the edge of town. The place was dark, its windows boarded up. He glanced around, making sure no one was following him. He didn't trust anyone anymore, not with Miller's network of allies keeping an eye on everything. He pushed the door open slowly, the creak of the hinges echoing through the empty space. The interior was just as abandoned as the outside, filled with dust and old crates. But there, in the corner, Garrett spotted a small pile of documents, all neatly stacked. He approached cautiously, his pulse quickening. As he flipped through the papers, his stomach dropped. This wasn't just about bribes or manipulated cases. This was bigger. The documents outlined a vast conspiracy, one that tied Miller to a network of wealthy businessmen, criminal syndicates, and corrupt politicians. The judge had been laundering money through off-the-books deals, funneling funds to people who could keep him in power. Garrett's hands shook as he read through the evidence. This was the smoking gun. Before he could finish, he heard a noise behind him. He spun around, his heart racing. A shadow moved in the doorway, and Garrett instinctively reached for his phone, ready to call for help. But as the figure stepped into the light, Garrett recognized him immediately. It was Jonathan Reed, a well-respected attorney in town who had worked with Garrett in the past. Reed's face was grim as he approached, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. "You've got everything you need, James," Reed said quietly. "But you have to act fast. Miller knows you're coming for him, and he's already making his move." Garrett nodded, a surge of determination rushing through him. This wasn't just about saving his reputation anymore. This was about stopping a man who had been destroying lives for far too long. Garrett was ready to do whatever it took. The day of the final trial arrived. The atmosphere in Springfield had shifted drastically. The town that had once feared Judge John Miller was now filled with whispers of his downfall. Garrett could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. The final battle was about to take place, and everything he had fought for was on the line. The courtroom was packed with reporters, citizens, and supporters, many of whom had never dared to speak out against Miller. But now they came in droves to witness the showdown. Garrett stood before the judge, a sense of determination washing over him. Today was not just about exposing Miller's corruption. Today, he would finish what he had started, freeing Springfield from the judge's grip. As Garrett took his place, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. It had started with a simple desire to bring justice to his town, but it had turned into something far greater. A battle against a system that had been broken for years. Judge Miller sat at his bench, his usual arrogance radiating off him. He had spent months preparing for this moment too. But unlike Garrett, Miller was about to face the consequences of his actions. The smug expression that had always been a hallmark of his demeanor was no longer quite as confident. Garrett had been relentless in his pursuit of justice, and it was beginning to show. "Mr. Garrett," Miller sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "I see you've brought your little files to play lawyer today. How charming." His words were laced with sarcasm, but they no longer carried the weight of the intimidation they once did. Garrett wasn't backing down. He wasn't intimidated. He was here for one reason: to see that justice was done. Garrett stepped forward, holding up the documents that would finally bring Miller down. "I didn't bring a lawyer, John," Garrett said, his voice steady and strong. "Because I am the lawyer, and I have the truth on my side." Miller's face twisted into a scowl. "You're playing a dangerous game, Garrett. You've made your move, but it's too late. This town will never turn on me." Garrett ignored the threats and pressed on, presenting evidence of Miller's long history of corruption, his acceptance of bribes, his manipulation of cases, his exploitation of his position to protect those with money and power. The documents Olivia had helped him uncover were damning. But that wasn't all. As Garrett continued, he saw Miller's self-assurance begin to crack. For the first time in a long while, the judge wasn't in control. The truth was too strong, and Miller was losing his grip. "I've heard your lies for years, John," Garrett said, his voice cutting through the tension. "But this time, you don't get to hide behind your gavel. The people of Springfield deserve better, and I will make sure they get it." The room was silent, hanging on every word. Garrett had the audience on his side now. They could feel it. The moment of reckoning was here. Judge Miller's eyes darted around the room, his bravado slipping away. He looked to his attorney, who sat frozen at the defense table, unsure of how to proceed. It was clear now that Miller didn't have the power he once did. His attempts to intimidate Garrett only made him look weak. As Garrett prepared to deliver the final blow, a voice from the back of the courtroom interrupted him. A figure stepped forward, holding up a folder of documents. The entire courtroom turned as Olivia Harrison made her way to the front. Garrett's heart skipped a beat. Olivia had been his key witness in exposing Miller's corruption, but he hadn't expected her to make an appearance in the courtroom. "Your Honor," Olivia said, her voice trembling but firm, "I have additional evidence that will expose the full extent of Judge Miller's crimes." The room went silent. Olivia opened the folder and placed it on the table. She flipped through the pages, revealing a trail of financial transactions, emails, and signed documents that proved Miller's involvement in money laundering and bribery. The evidence was undeniable. Miller's face drained of color as he saw what Olivia had brought forward. He looked like a man cornered, trapped by his own lies and manipulations. "This," Olivia said, her voice unwavering, "is just a small portion of the evidence. There's more, much more. Judge Miller has been profiting off the suffering of Springfield's people for years, and I have the proof to back it up." Judge Miller tried to object, but his voice cracked. "This is preposterous," he shouted, his usual confidence now completely gone. "You can't prove any of this. It's all lies." Garrett stepped forward, his eyes locking with Miller's. "No, John. The lies are yours, and the truth is coming for you." As the room erupted into murmurs of disbelief, Garrett turned to the gallery. "This man," he said, pointing toward Miller, "has abused his position for far too long. He used the power of his courtroom to protect the wealthy and powerful, while destroying the lives of those who needed help the most. But today, that ends." Miller's mouth went dry, and for the first time, the reality of his downfall set in. His once imposing presence had been reduced to a man caught in his own web of corruption. The court, which had once been his kingdom, was now his courtroom of reckoning. "Order! Order in this courtroom!" Miller yelled, slamming his gavel down in desperation. But no one was listening to him anymore. The jig was up. Garrett turned to the prosecutor, Jonathan Reed, who had been sitting quietly throughout the proceedings. You have everything you need, Jonathan, Garrett said, his voice full of resolve. It's time to bring this man to justice. As Reed nodded, the prosecutor stood and addressed the court. In light of the overwhelming evidence, I motion that Judge Miller be immediately removed from the bench and arrested for his criminal activities. The room fell into chaos. The once feared judge was now a criminal. Garrett's eyes met Olivia's across the room, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to smile. The battle was won, but this was just the beginning. The courtroom was in an uproar. People stood, shouted, and cheered as the judge who had ruled over Springfield with an iron fist was led out in handcuffs. Judge John Miller, the man who had long been untouchable, was now nothing more than a criminal in the eyes of the law. His downfall had been swift, and for many in Springfield, it felt like the first breath of freedom they had taken in years. James Garrett stood at the front of the courtroom, watching as Miller was escorted away. There was a sense of vindication in the air, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the battle was far from over. He had exposed Miller's crimes, and the judge was being held accountable for the first time in his life. But Garrett also knew that the people who had enabled Miller, the powerful businessmen, the corrupt officials, and the criminals who had benefited from his rulings, would not go down quietly. Miller's arrest was just the beginning. The war for justice was far from won. As the chaos in the courtroom began to settle, Garrett turned to Olivia Harrison, who had helped him bring Miller to justice. She had been instrumental in gathering the evidence that had sealed Miller's fate, and Garrett knew that without her help, this moment would never have come. "Olivia," Garrett said, his voice low, "we did it. He's gone." Olivia nodded, but her face was troubled. "It's not over, James. Miller's arrest is just the beginning. There are people out there who will want to silence you now, people who will do whatever it takes to protect themselves." Garrett's jaw tightened. "I know, but we can't stop now. We have the evidence. We have the truth. The people of Springfield are behind us. This is our chance to clean up this town for good." But Olivia was right to be cautious. As soon as the news of Miller's arrest hit the media, the town of Springfield was flooded with reactions. Some cheered. Some wept with relief. But there were also whispers, shadows moving in the background. Garrett knew that Miller had powerful allies who wouldn't let him fall without a fight. That night, Garrett sat in his office, reviewing the latest reports. News outlets were already covering Miller's arrest in full detail, and the people of Springfield were speaking out more than ever before. But there were disturbing signs, anonymous threats, veiled warnings from influential people, and rumors that the powerful forces behind Miller's reign were organizing a counterattack. The phone on Garrett's desk rang, cutting through the silence of the room. He picked it up, his hand trembling slightly. "James," a voice on the other end said, calm but urgent. "You need to listen carefully. There's more. Miller's arrest is just the first part of the plan. He's not the only one we need to bring down. You've made enemies, and they'll be coming for you." It was Jonathan Reed, the attorney who had stood by Garrett throughout the trial. He had been a crucial ally in getting the case against Miller off the ground. But now, the stakes were even higher. "What do you mean, Jonathan?" Garrett asked, his mind racing. "I've been digging into Miller's finances," Reed said, his voice tense. "And I've uncovered something. He wasn't just laundering money. He was working with a criminal syndicate that operates across the state. The people Miller was protecting weren't just businessmen. They were part of something much bigger." Garrett's stomach sank. "What are you saying? Miller was working with criminals?" "Exactly," Reed replied. "And I think they've been working to protect their operations for years. Miller was the one person who kept them safe. Without him, they're exposed. And now, they'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves. Garrett leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. What's the next step, then? We need to get this information out, but we need to do it carefully, Reed said. Miller's arrest was just the beginning. If we expose everything at once, we risk losing control. We need to make sure we have everything lined up before we move forward. Garrett nodded, his resolve hardening. We'll do it, but we need to be ready. These people will stop at nothing to protect their interests. Later that evening, Garrett received a text message from an unknown number. It read, "You made a mistake, Garrett. And now you're going to pay for it." The message sent a chill down his spine. It was a threat. But from who? Was it Miller's associates trying to intimidate him into backing down? Garrett knew this wasn't just about Miller anymore. It was about his own survival. The message wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration of war. He had made enemies, powerful enemies, and they weren't going to let him walk away from this without a fight. He immediately contacted Chief Harris, who had been working with him to ensure his safety since the beginning of the battle. Harris had been with Garrett every step of the way, and Garrett knew that without his support, he wouldn't have made it this far. "We need to be on high alert," Garrett said to Harris over the phone. "Someone's coming for me. I don't know who, but I know it's not over." Harris was silent for a moment, then spoke with the calm authority Garrett had come to rely on. "I've been tracking some of Miller's old contacts," he said. "There's a network of people who have been lying low, waiting for the right moment. They're still out there, and they're going to make their move soon." Garrett's blood ran cold. "How soon?" "Sooner than you think," Harris replied. "We'll need to move fast, James. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes." The next few days were a blur of preparations. Garrett worked with Harris and his team to gather intel on Miller's associates, while Reed dug deeper into the criminal syndicate's operations. But no matter how hard they worked, the threat of retaliation loomed over them. One evening, as Garrett sat alone in his office, staring out at the city below, the weight of everything finally hit him. He had fought for justice, exposed the corruption that had been poisoning Springfield for years, but now it was personal. This wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about his own life, and the lives of those he cared about. He could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Somewhere, someone was making their move. Garrett had no intention of backing down, but he knew that he had to stay one step ahead. Because if he didn't, the very people he had fought to protect might become the next targets. The weight of the world seemed to rest on James Garrett's shoulders. The taste of victory over Judge Miller was still fresh, but the threats and whispers of retaliation grew louder by the day. The phone call from Jonathan Reed earlier that week had been a stark reminder. This wasn't just about Miller anymore. It was about the criminal syndicate that had been operating under the judge's protection for years. The web of corruption stretched far wider than Garrett had ever imagined, and now the stakes were higher than ever. Garrett's mind raced as he sat in his office that evening, the lights of Springfield twinkling in the distance. Despite the progress they had made, he knew that he couldn't relax. Miller's arrest had been just the beginning, and the people behind him were already working to protect their interests. A knock on his office door snapped Garrett out of his thoughts. He quickly stood and opened the door, surprised to find Chief Harris standing there, his expression grim. "James, we've got a problem," Harris said, his voice low. Garrett raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" "There's been a break-in at Olivia's place," Harris explained, his face hardening. "Her apartment was torn apart. Furniture was overturned. Documents were destroyed. They're sending a message." A chill ran down Garrett's spine. Olivia had been instrumental in bringing down Miller, and now it seemed like she was in immediate danger. He had known that Miller's allies wouldn't go down without a fight, but this was different. It was personal. "I need to see her," Garrett said, his voice urgent. "Where is she?" "She's with us," Harris replied. "We're keeping her under protection for now, but we need to act fast. Whoever's behind this knows that she's the key to everything." Garrett nodded, his mind already racing through the possibilities. He knew that if Miller's associates had discovered Olivia's involvement, they wouldn't hesitate to do anything to silence her. And that meant Garrett had to move quickly. Within the hour, Garrett arrived at the safe house where Olivia was staying. She looked shaken, her eyes red from crying, but she was alive. And that, for now, was the most important thing. "Olivia," Garrett said softly, sitting beside her. "Are you okay?" She nodded, but it was clear she wasn't. "They were looking for something. The documents I gave you. They didn't find them, but they'll keep coming. I know they will." Garrett placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression resolute. "They're not going to get to you. We're going to finish this, Olivia. We'll make sure you're safe." Her eyes met his, and for a moment there was a flicker of hope. But then the reality set in. The battle had escalated from exposing a corrupt judge to protecting the very people who had dared to stand up to the system. "We need to take the fight to them," Garrett said, standing up. "This has gone on long enough. We have enough evidence now. We can bring down the rest of Miller's network." Olivia looked at him, a mix of fear and determination in her eyes. "How do we do that?" "We go public," Garrett replied. "We expose everything. The bribes, the money laundering, the connections. It's time to hit them where it hurts. We bring everything into the light, and they'll have nowhere to hide." But as Garrett made his plans, something didn't sit right with him. The break-in had been too coordinated, too quick. Whoever was behind it had to have been watching them for a while. The walls were closing in faster than Garrett had anticipated. Later that night, Garrett met with Harris again. They were in a quiet, secure location, far away from prying eyes. "I've been thinking about it," Garrett said, his voice low. "This isn't just about Miller's associates. There are people in Springfield who have been protecting him, people who are trying to keep everything in place." Harris nodded. "Yeah, I've been digging into some of Miller's old connections, and I'm starting to think that the syndicate runs deeper than we thought. This is a whole network of powerful people, not just local, but statewide. They're tied to the bigger criminal enterprises, and they won't give up without a fight." "Then we need to make sure they know we're coming for them," Garrett said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "We need to get this information out, but carefully. I want to bring them all down, but if we act too fast, we risk losing control." Harris looked at him, understanding the gravity of the situation. "We'll need help. We can't do this alone." Garrett thought for a moment, then nodded. "Get Reed on the phone. We need to start gathering allies, people who can help us expose this syndicate and put pressure on those still in power." But Garrett's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. Harris stood quickly, moving toward it cautiously. He opened it, only to find a figure standing in the shadows, a man Garrett didn't recognize. "Who's this?" Garrett asked, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone. Was this another threat? The man stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "I have information. I'm here to help." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" "I'm someone who knows how this syndicate operates," the man said, his face partially obscured by the shadows. "I've been watching for a while. I want to bring them down too. But I can't do it alone." Garrett hesitated, Was this a trap? Or was this someone offering the help they desperately needed? He studied the man's face, trying to gauge if he could trust him. "What do you know?" Garrett asked, his tone measured. The man hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "Everything. I know who's funding the syndicate, who's behind it all. But you have to act fast. They're already preparing for retaliation. They know you're coming for them." Garrett stood in the silence of the room, weighing the decision before him. He had never been one to trust easily, but something about this man's words rang true. The enemy was already moving against them. It was time to act. The atmosphere in Springfield had shifted from hopeful to tense, as the battle that had begun with the exposure of Judge Miller's corruption intensified. James Garrett knew the clock was ticking. The syndicate that had shielded Miller for so long wasn't going to let him fall without a fight. They were already making their move, and if Garrett didn't act quickly, the momentum they had built would be lost. The mysterious man who had shown up at Garrett's office earlier that night had provided vital information about the syndicate's structure and the key players involved. But it wasn't enough to just know who they were. They needed evidence. Hard, irrefutable evidence. Garrett knew that if they were going to bring down the entire network, they had to expose everything. No more secrets. No more half measures. The people of Springfield deserved to know the full extent of the corruption that had been poisoning their town for years. "James," Jonathan Reed said, as they sat around a table in the dimly lit safe house, "we're getting close. I've cross-referenced the documents from Olivia and the files the man brought us. This is bigger than we thought. Miller wasn't just laundering money. The syndicate is funding political campaigns, paying off law enforcement, even controlling major businesses. The people who have been protecting him are at the highest levels." Garrett leaned forward, his expression steely. "So, what do we do now?" Reed paused before answering, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "We need to expose them all. Every last one of them. The problem is, these people are prepared to fight back. They've got too much power, and they'll stop at nothing to protect their interests." "I don't care what they do," Garrett said, his voice unwavering. "They've had control for too long. We can't back down now." Harris, who had been silently listening, spoke up. "We've got the evidence, James, but we need to be smart about how we release it. If we go public with all of it at once, we risk putting ourselves in danger before we can make sure the pieces are in place." Garrett nodded. "You're right. We can't just go barging in. We'll need to leak the information strategically, build pressure on the syndicate, make them react, and then we strike." The plan was risky, but Garrett knew it was the only way. They would use the media to slowly drip-feed the information, revealing bits and pieces at a time, making sure the public outcry grew with each revelation. Once they had enough support from the people of Springfield, they would move in for the final strike. But even as they planned, Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that the enemy was already one step ahead. The break-in at Olivia's apartment had been a clear warning. The syndicate knew they were closing in, and that meant Garrett and his team were running out of time. Later that night, as Garrett prepared to make the first move in their plan, he received a call that sent a chill down his spine. It was from Olivia. "James," Olivia's voice was shaky, "I'm in trouble. They know where I am. I don't know how, but they found me. I'm being watched." Garrett's heart pounded. "Olivia, you need to get out of there. We'll send someone to pick you up. Just stay calm." But Olivia was already panicking. "I can't. I don't know who they are, but they're getting closer. James, they're coming for me. They're coming for us all." Garrett's mind raced. They had no time to waste. "Stay where you are. I'm coming for you." Within minutes, Garrett and Harris were on their way to the safe house where Olivia was staying. As they approached the building, Garrett's phone buzzed again. It was a text message from an unknown number. He hesitated before opening it. "You're too late, Garrett," the message read. "We've already started making our move. You can't stop what's coming." Garrett clenched his fists, his blood running cold. The syndicate was moving faster than he had anticipated. They weren't just going to let this happen. They would fight back, and they wouldn't hesitate to use violence to protect their power. When Garrett and Harris reached the building, they found Olivia's apartment in disarray. The door was ajar, and the windows had been smashed. It was clear that whoever had been sent after her had left in a hurry, but not without leaving a message. Garrett scanned the room, his heart racing. There was no sign of Olivia. She was gone. "They took her," Garrett said through gritted teeth, his voice filled with fury. "We need to find her. Now." Harris's face was grim. "We'll find her, James. We can't let them get away with this." As Garrett prepared to leave the apartment, he saw a piece of paper fluttering to the ground. It had been tucked under a chair, just out of sight. Garrett picked it up, scanning the contents quickly. It was a list of names, people Garrett didn't recognize. But there, at the bottom of the list, was one name that made his stomach drop: Preston Wallace. It was the judge's name, but something didn't feel right. Garrett had thought Miller was the central figure in the syndicate, but now it appeared there were others pulling the strings, people who had been working with Miller from the very beginning. "We're going to need help," Garrett muttered, his mind racing. "I need to get this information out now, before it's too late." Harris nodded. "Let's move." As Garrett walked out of the apartment and into the night, he realized that the battle had escalated beyond what he had ever anticipated. It was no longer just about justice. It was about survival. The syndicate had made their move, and now it was time for Garrett to make his final push. The clock was ticking. The walls were closing in on James Garrett, and every minute felt like a lifetime. Olivia was still missing, taken by the very people they had been fighting against. Her disappearance was a devastating blow, but Garrett knew that the fight had to go on. He couldn't afford to let fear take over. If he was going to end this once and for all, he had to expose the entire syndicate. All of it. No more hiding in the shadows. The people of Springfield had to see the full scope of the corruption that had been festering in their town for decades. As Garrett and Harris made their way through the dark streets, Garrett's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text message. It was a video. He opened it cautiously, already bracing for the worst. The video was shaky, filmed from what appeared to be a hidden camera. The image was grainy, but it was clear enough. It showed Olivia, her hands tied to a chair, her face bruised but still defiant. Her eyes met the camera with a fierce, determined look. "James," she said in a hoarse voice, "I'm okay. But you need to stop. They're going to kill you if you keep pushing. They'll do anything to protect themselves. Get out while you still can." The video cut off abruptly. Garrett's heart slammed against his chest. He had known this wouldn't be easy. But this was personal. Olivia had put herself in danger for the truth. And now it was up to Garrett to make sure her sacrifice wasn't in vain. "I'm not stopping, Harris," Garrett said, his voice tight with determination. "We're not backing down. Not now. Not ever." Harris said nothing, but Garrett could see the understanding in his eyes. They had come this far, and they weren't going to let anything, or anyone, stand in their way. As they reached the safe house, Garrett's mind raced. He knew the syndicate was already moving to cover their tracks. Olivia's capture was likely just the beginning. But now, with the video in hand, Garrett had a new plan. He needed to leak the information. Not just in small doses, but all at once. They couldn't wait any longer. If they were going to bring down the people behind Miller, they had to hit them where it hurt. "Prepare the press conference," Garrett said to Harris. "We're going public. Every single detail. We expose them all." Harris nodded, already on his phone, setting up the logistics. Garrett's mind raced as he prepared for the final confrontation. He had the evidence, the list of names, the money trail, the dirty dealings. He knew that Miller was just the tip of the iceberg. The real danger lay in the people who had been pulling the strings all along. The press conference was scheduled for the following morning. As Garrett stood before the podium, a sense of calm washed over him. This was it, the final push, the end of everything Miller had built. The reporters in the room were already murmuring, the cameras flashing as Garrett stepped to the microphone. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Garrett took a deep breath, then began to speak, his voice steady and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," Garrett began, his eyes scanning the room, "what you are about to hear will change everything. For years, this town has been controlled by a corrupt system that has protected the powerful and the criminal, while silencing the voices of the people who needed justice the most. Today, we expose the truth." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The room was completely still. Everyone was listening. "Judge John Miller wasn't the only one who was corrupt," Garrett continued. "He was just the puppet, and the people pulling the strings are the real criminals. I have here the evidence that proves their involvement in money laundering, bribery, and the manipulation of cases to benefit the wealthy and powerful." Garrett placed a stack of papers on the podium, the documents thudding heavily as they landed. "These are just some of the names involved. Businessmen, politicians, and law enforcement officers who have been shielding Miller's operation for years. They thought they could operate in the shadows, but today, we bring their secrets into the light." As Garrett spoke, the reporters scribbled furiously, trying to keep up with the magnitude of the revelations. He could feel the weight of the moment. This was the beginning of the end for the syndicate. With the evidence now in the hands of the public, there was no turning back. "The people behind Miller thought they could control Springfield forever," Garrett said, his voice rising. "But they were wrong. The people of Springfield deserve better. They deserve justice." Just as Garrett was about to continue, the doors of the press conference room burst open, and a man stepped forward. Garrett recognized him instantly, one of Miller's former associates, someone he had seen at the courthouse during the trial. The man was flanked by two others, both carrying weapons. The room froze. "This is a mistake, Garrett," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "You've crossed the line. You should have backed off when you had the chance. Now, you're going to pay for it." The reporters shrank back, the tension escalating. Harris, who had been standing off to the side, moved quickly, positioning himself between Garrett and the armed men. The situation had escalated faster than anyone had expected. Garrett's heart raced, but he didn't show it. This was exactly what they had been preparing for. The moment had come. "I'm not afraid of you," Garrett said, his voice firm. "You'll have to do a lot more than that to stop me." The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think you can expose us and walk away, Garrett? You're as much a part of this as Miller. And now, you're going to pay for it." The sound of sirens suddenly cut through the tension, and the doors to the press room slammed open again. A group of uniformed officers rushed in, led by Chief Harris. Garrett's eyes flickered to Harris, who gave him a slight nod. The situation was under control. The officers quickly subdued the men, disarming them and taking them into custody. Garrett took a deep breath, his pulse still pounding in his ears. The syndicate had made their move, but Garrett and his team had anticipated it. The final push had worked. The truth was out. As the officers escorted the men away, Garrett turned to the press. "This is just the beginning. We will not stop until every last person involved in this corrupt system is held accountable." The reporters erupted into questions, but Garrett knew that for the first time, the power had shifted. The people had the truth, and with it, they would finally have their justice. The weeks that followed Garrett's press conference were a whirlwind of legal battles, public outcry, and a desperate attempt by the remaining members of the syndicate to cover their tracks. But Garrett, bolstered by the support of the people and the weight of the evidence they had uncovered, was unstoppable. The public was on his side, and the truth was too powerful to ignore. Judge John Miller's arrest had been the catalyst, but it was only the beginning. The names Garrett had revealed to the world, the businessmen, politicians, and law enforcement officers who had been complicit in the syndicate's operation, were now under investigation. Their dirty dealings were exposed for all to see, and one by one, they were brought to justice. The town of Springfield, once held captive by fear and corruption, began to heal. For the first time in years, the people could breathe easy. They could walk the streets without the ever-present threat of manipulation or abuse of power. Garrett's victory was not just for him, but for every citizen who had been oppressed by Miller's regime. But as much as Garrett wanted to savor the success, there was still the matter of Olivia. She had been the linchpin in their efforts, and Garrett had made it his mission to find her. She had been taken by the syndicate during the most dangerous part of the fight, and Garrett couldn't let her sacrifice be in vain. It wasn't long before Garrett received the call he had been waiting for. Olivia had been found, alive, but shaken. She had been hidden away, held by those who had once served Miller, but her will to fight for justice had never wavered. She had been rescued in a coordinated operation between Garrett's team and the authorities, and now she was back. When Garrett saw Olivia for the first time since her capture, he could see the toll the ordeal had taken on her. Her eyes were tired, her face pale, but there was a strength in her that couldn't be broken. She had helped bring down the most powerful judge in Springfield's history, and she had done it at great personal cost. "I'm so glad you're okay," Garrett said, his voice filled with relief. He could see that the ordeal had left scars on her, but he knew she was stronger than ever. Olivia gave him a small smile. "I'm not the hero, James. You were the one who took this all the way. You were the one who refused to back down." Garrett shook his head. "We did it together. I couldn't have done this without you." As the days passed, the legal proceedings against the remaining members of the syndicate moved forward. Each one was carefully brought to trial, the evidence against them irrefutable. The powerful connections they had relied on for so long had crumbled under the weight of the truth. The arrest of Miller had been the first domino to fall, but it had set off a chain reaction that brought down an entire criminal empire. Garrett's victory was celebrated across the town. The people of Springfield threw a celebration in his honor, but Garrett didn't need the recognition. For him, the victory was in the small moments, the smiles of those who had once feared the justice system, the relief in their eyes as they realized they no longer had to live in fear. But even as the town celebrated, Garrett knew that the work was far from finished. There was still a lot to rebuild: a broken legal system, fractured relationships, and the trust of a community that had been betrayed. It would take time, but Garrett was ready for the challenge. One evening, as Garrett sat alone in his office, reflecting on everything that had transpired, there was a knock at the door. He looked up to see Olivia standing there, a file in her hands. "You've done it, James," she said softly. "We've done it." Miller and his people are behind bars, but there's still so much to do. There are other cases, other people who need help, and we can't forget about them. Garrett smiled, his eyes tired but determined. I know, and I'm ready to keep fighting. The work isn't over, but we've made a real change. We've shown people that justice can prevail. Olivia sat down across from him, placing the file on his desk. This is just the beginning. There's a lot of work left to do, but I think we're on the right path. As Garrett looked out the window, watching the sun set over Springfield, he knew that this battle had changed everything. The fight for justice had been long and hard, but it had been worth it. They had exposed the truth, and in doing so, they had given the people of Springfield a new hope. The storm had passed, but the real work had just begun. It would take time to rebuild, to restore the damage that had been done. But with the truth on their side, Garrett knew that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. And for the first time in a long time, the future of Springfield looked bright.